Greetings, welcome to our session. Before we get started, my name is Margaret Allen, and I'm the Director of National Programs at the Institute for Court Management at the National Center for State Courts. I'm so pleased to be here with Dana Bartocci. She's the Director of Human Resources and Development for the Minnesota Judicial Branch, and also Julie Edwards McDaniel. She's my colleague at ICM, our curriculum developer, and we're really pleased to be here today to talk with you about a really important topic these days, virtual education, what you need to know. We're going to be talking about this as it relates to the NACM core, and we have lots to talk about, so we'll just go ahead and jump in. As I said, we'll talk about the NACM core, particularly the educational development competency. Then Julie will talk with you about engagement tips and how to really keep your participants engaged, even in the virtual learning environment. And then Dana will close us up with stories from the virtual classroom. We did a survey of the National Association of State Judicial Educators, your colleagues in each state who develop education for judges and court staff, and have been finding out what they have been doing during this year when most of us have moved to all or nearly all remote learning. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so you may recognize this. In fact, let me talk to you about how we're going to communicate. Of course, the session is recorded, but all three of us are live with you in the chat. So on the landing page, what you'll do is scroll down a little bit, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the chat feature. It will ask you, it'll know your name already. It'll ask you to put in where you're from, and then you're free to chat. And we're here live with you watching the recording, and we were glad to interact with you. So I'd like you to simply say yes if you have seen this before, or no if you haven't in the chat. So in the 90s, leadership of the National Association for Court Management just put together a dream team of court professionals to talk about what were the most important things for court managers to know and to be able to do. And this was the original graphic. So we see purposes and responsibilities of courts in the center, and then shooting off from that, many topic areas that court managers are very familiar with. Indeed, these are the core competencies. Fast forward, about 5 years ago, NACM refreshed the NACM core competencies. It's now called the NACM core, and we've got a new graphic. And we see now that there are 3 different modules: principle, practice, and vision. And we're going to be in the practice module today talking about the educational development competency. So, again, you can see that they're organized in a slightly different way graphically, but, many of the same topics are here, but refreshed. There are some new competencies as well. And these are great resources for any court manager. And if you are doing education related to these topics, they're really, really valuable. And I'm going to show you what's on offer through NACM. All right, so at the NACMcore.org website, this is a sample homepage. The pages are updated every once in a while to feature a different competency. But in that red section there, you'll see a core content button. And so you'll be able to see all 13 competencies. Then there's always a featured competency on the page. It's leadership right now, but it'll change from time to time. And then you can also connect to the National Association for Court Management itself. Of course, all of these sessions are free in the virtual conference this year, which is such a gift to the court community. If you are not a NACM member, just many, many valuable resources for court managers. All right, so included in each competency, including the educational development competency, you'll see several items. There's an introduction. You'll see learning objectives related to that competency. It'll talk about how to use the curriculum. It'll talk about the NACM core and how this competency fits into the entire collection of competencies. It'll talk about a target audience that you might want to consider for this material. In addition, you'll also see educational content, resources for faculty, participant activities. So those are things that take some time to develop. And it's nice that there are some participant activities already created and ready for you to use if you're doing an education session on educational development or any of the topics. You'll see special notes for faculty and then also a bibliography. So this is really, really valuable. Of course, can view it on the website, go ahead and print it out, whatever you would like, and it's all there. And so let me explain that for each competency, there's a curriculum design. And what I've just walked through are the different pieces of that curriculum design. And so it can be helpful just as a self-study tool, but also for folks who are designing education for their section, their department, their court, the state, just depending on what your role is, these resources can be very helpful. Also, to add to your resources, there's a core guide, which you see on the left there, and that is available on the NACMCore.org website, and it just gives an overview of all 13 modules and how you might want to use the materials. And so that's really, really valuable. I encourage you to check it out. And then for each competency, there's a specific guide. So we put up a picture of the educational development competency, but you'd see them for the other 12 competencies as well. All right, so now I've been telling you we're going to talk about the educational development competency. We're here. And so on the homepage for the educational development competency, there are two things that you're going to see. There's a link so that you can download the curriculum and so that you can view the core competency. So those are those two arrows that you see on that web page. And that's the same layout for each of the competencies. All right, so you may be thinking, education isn't a big part of what I do. It's just one of the many hats I wear. But I encourage you to kind of perhaps think of yourself in a new way, because education is key to the ongoing development of your staff, their efficiency, productivity, how much they enjoy their jobs even. And so you as a court leader can ensure that education is the following things. We want it to be continuous and creative. And so not just happening when someone's first hired, but continuing throughout the time that a person is employed in your organization. We want it to be inclusive in all ways. And that goes, I'm going to speak for a minute about having education for all levels of employees, because we do tend to focus on supervisors and managers, but folks who aren't in those roles also need education and really benefit from it. It should be accessible and tailored. So we want it to speak to what employees need to know and be able to do, and need to make it accessible. That's absolutely a watchword in 2020 when we're not able to gather in person as we did most often for education. Should be well managed, starting and ending on time, being organized, being prepared, all of those good things. And then another watchword for 2020, delivered using multiple mechanisms. This is what this whole session is about. We took our model for education, which largely, not 100%, but largely was an in-person model, and now have moved to virtual delivery. And we're going to talk about some of those different methods in just a moment. And then I can't stress this enough, evaluate your education, whether it's electronic or paper. Give your employees, your students an evaluation so that they can tell you what they thought of the education, not only the content, but the delivery. That's something at the Institute for Court Management that we're very interested in, as we're offering our courses virtually, really for the first time this year. We want to know how can we fine tune this so that both the delivery and the content are at the high level we want it to be. All right, so we're going to continue our tour of the educational development competency. There are 5 sections. I've highlighted one section, and you're going to get to see that close up a little in just a moment. So before I go to the section we're going to highlight, the 5 sections are education in the courts, fundamentals. The second section, education's effective implementation, education of the court culture, resources for education, and then court managers as leaders for judicial branch education. And so again, this isn't to transform you from your current role to being a judicial branch educator officially, but it will give you information about important elements of education as you're a consumer of education for yourself, your colleagues, and your staff. So we are going to focus on section 2, and that's going to pop up here in just a moment. 5 sections in this area of the competency as well. So adults with learners, learning styles, instructional design, delivery mechanisms, and charting an educational path. So you might not be surprised to hear that we are going to focus on 2.4 delivery mechanisms. And as I get into this, I would like you to type in the chat how you are either offering or how you're participating in education during the pandemic. You may have staff and you yourself may be working at home, but how are you creating educational opportunities, and how are you participating in educational opportunities? So could say in person, online, blended, et cetera. So we're going to talk about some of these methods now. So the first way to deliver education, the way we used to do it up until about March of this year even, in-person delivery, we'd all come together at a site and go through a learning experience together. The second is electronic delivery, synchronous. And so that's when the presenter and the participants are live together in the virtual classroom. Next is asynchronous, and so that is when it's an online learning experience where it's not live, it's some type of a recorded session that participants are viewing and interacting with. And then finally, there is blended delivery, which is what we're doing now. We're recording this presentation, and then you're watching the recording, but we're getting to chat live throughout the presentation. And keep those questions coming, by the way. All right, so before we talk about electronic delivery, our focus for today, I'm just going to do a couple of definitions. Webinars, I feel somewhat that we're experts at this point, but webinars are generally a shorter session, maybe 1 or 2 hours. Generally, there's less interaction between faculty and participants, and then among the participants themselves, and they generally are less expensive to produce. A virtual course is really a deep dive into content. So what you might think of when you think of going to an education session, it can be multiple days, several hours, and it does contain more interaction, and not only between the faculty and the participants, but among the participants themselves. And so there's that interchange. And so that can happen via a poll, the chat, breakout rooms, using the Annotate feature. You're going to hear a lot about this in just a little bit from my colleague, Julie. So for some things to think about for synchronous electronic delivery, the presenter and the participants are together live in the virtual classroom. It is key, even if you have a curriculum that you've used time and time again for in-person delivery, you're going to want to make some adaptations to that, because not everything that works well in person is going to work exactly the same way in the virtual classroom. So make sure that you spend that time to make those adaptations, to make things and adjustments, to make things work smoothly in the virtual learning environment. And what that will do is, because you kind of have a barrier, you're not together in one room, but by creating those engagement opportunities, you recreate the in-person classroom experience as much as you possibly can. All right, so for asynchronous delivery, there are also some things to think about. Sometimes we can be lulled into thinking, all right, well, it's asynchronous. People are kind of watching the video. So I did this in-person course. I'm going to record it. I'm going to put that up online and people can watch it. And that really is not that effective, because unlike the participants who got to sit there live and experience the in-person presentation, folks watching the lecture, if it's just the video lecture, they're not having those interactive experiences. They're not being able to engage, and so that really affects how sticky the learning is and how much folks are going to retain. So if you're not putting up just a recording, what do? You work with a curriculum designer and instructional designer to create an online learning experience that's really interactive. And so there's a lot involved in that. It can be lengthy and expensive. It's not to say that it's not worth doing, but in times like these, we sometimes need to, identify a need for education and then be able to offer that education pretty quickly. And so sometimes we to go through the development process for asynchronous online learning. In addition, the shelf life can be short. And so you spend the time and the resources to develop an online course, and then we know whether it's case law, a societal change, new research, for all kinds of reasons, material may be out of date soon. And so just things, I'm not dissuading you from developing asynchronous online education, but just want to give you some things to think about. All right, I would give you an example of something we did in a recent Institute for Court Management course. And what you're seeing is a score sheet. And normally people would be sitting in the in-person classroom looking at that score sheet. They've just done performance measurement instrument, and they scored it. And so now people need to put their score on the sheet. And so they're going to score themselves 1 through 12 in those 4 areas. So what we were able to do, offering the course virtually, it was pretty exciting and something that had never taken place even in the in-person classroom. So the instructor walked them through taking the instrument, scoring the instrument, and then said, okay, now it's time to mark your scores, how you scored yourself. Of course, this is all anonymous. And so folks use the Annotate feature, which you'll learn about in just a moment, and mark their scores on the sheet. They continued doing that, and so this is a class of about 50 people who were all putting their scores there. And then, this is the really exciting part, folks connected the dots for their scores. And so whereas in the in-person classroom, folks would have just been sitting there and just seeing their own score, which is valuable. Nothing wrong with that. It's good to do that self-reflection, but to be able to see how others, and this was a group of folks all from one state, how others scored themselves was really, really fascinating and instructive. And so that leads into the next slide. I know for myself and perhaps for you, you've had a kind of a paradigm shift in your thinking. So maybe in early March, it was okay. We've always done it in person. We have to do education online. I'm not sure what it's going to be like. To a new way of thinking, that we get to explore this new option that may even have better outcomes. And so for us, and I hope for you, it's been pretty exciting to explore this, what may be new territory in offering education online. And now I am going to give the floor to Julie, and she is going to talk to you about really how to engage learners in the virtual classroom. Julie, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Margaret. If there's anything that I hope you guys all come away with from today, is that you're excited about the opportunities before us to start offering education in new and engaging ways. Engaging tools vary from the ones that we have used in different platforms. And so we have some that are used in many platforms, but other platforms that may not have these engagement tools that we'll talk about today, you may be able to use outside applications for similar engagement. When picking your engagement tool, it's good to choose one that fits the activity or the content that you're going to be providing. For online learning, it's best to use an engagement tool approximately every 15 minutes. And you can minimize silence in the online learning by letting the person know who you want to talk. Call on them by name. Let them know what it is you want them to talk about. And then continue to talk for a few more moments. This is going to give that person a few moments to prepare themselves, think about what they want to say or ask. use the raise hand feature when available. And then when you call on them, they can unmute themselves and begin to talk. And this is going to minimize awkward silence in the online format. Speaking of muting and unmuting, it is always good for participants to stay on mute in the online classroom and then only unmute themselves when they're called on to share, ask questions, tell stories, etc. It's best to call on the person that you want to talk, and that helps to avoid multiple people talking at once. Another way to have a conversation in the online classroom is through chat. We've been using this is also going to be used by participants who might be less inclined to speak up in the virtual format. Polling is a great example of matching the engagement tool to the type of learning. You can share the answers or statistics of a particular question or questions that help add to the discussion. And then you can share the results of those questions with everyone to help add to the topic. While polls are some of the best to prepare in advance of a class, some formats are going to allow you to have a quick polling, like check the check mark or an X for yes or no, or this or that type of questions. This is similar to having a group of people raise their hand to answer a question in the in-person format. And while raising a hand in the in-person format is a good way to get view of the responses to a particular question, in the virtual format, the hand raise is best used when you want them to unmute themselves and then to provide verbal feedback. And it's important that you tell them you're going to have them raise their hand. Let them know when you're getting ready to call on them. And then it's also important to use it. Make sure that you use the hand raise feature, call on participants from the participant list. And if you do this consistently, the participants are going to get used to it, and it becomes more natural in the online learning environment. It's also important to monitor hand raises. It might be good to have a moderator or a second faculty member who can watch the participant list and let you know when there might be a question. Like chat, Annotate allows for fun, creative ways for us to engage. It changes things up a little bit. Margaret showed us a great example earlier. Here you can see participants using the stamp feature to let us know where they're from. And participants can even use text when annotating on the screen. Now, before I turn it over to Dana, I just have two more features I want to talk about. Videos are a great way to share content in a different way and to create more conversation. Now, how they're viewed by the participant depends largely on their broadband and their internet connection. So you want to think about how you might share a video. You can share it through the platform that you might be using, or you might want to consider just giving the participant the link. Let them go out, watch the video on their own device, and then come back, and using one of these engagement tools, they can let you know that they've returned to class and they're ready to go on. Using webcams during an online class also helps to increase connections and interactions and really helps to increase that face-to-face feel when you're in the virtual classroom. Now, one of my favorite features is the breakout rooms. Breakout rooms provide a great way for small group work activities. They really help build engagement, and they're a great networking opportunity. Now, I'm going to pass this off to Dana, who's going to talk to us about how she's used some of these engagement tools, as well as some other tips for online learning. Dana?
Right now in the chat, I want you all to write what city and state you are from. Take a moment and look to see who's here. You may feel alone in your office, in your home office, wherever you might be. But as you see these scrolling in, you feel a connection. You feel a connection to those who are in court management throughout the US and perhaps the world as they're answering the question of where they're from. I mention this because 64% of the National Association of State Judicial Educators surveyed said they've done onboarding remotely. When we think about starting a new job, One of the biggest things that we want to do with onboarding is create those connections. And it's much harder in this virtual atmosphere unless we use virtual education to our advantage. Think about when you first started that job. Did you know the culture of your organization? Did you know who to go to? Did you even know the person in the office next door? And now imagine you starting remotely or starting in a virtual environment. We did survey the judicial educators throughout the states to give you some of these real world examples of what our states are doing for education. And a lot of the states surveyed are also represented here now that we can see that in the chat. When we start virtual education or even a meeting, meetings are educational too. You can use a lot of these same things for meetings. A great tip is to start with a question in the comment box or in the chat feature. You can start right away with something like, I just did with what state are you from? Or something more fun like, what's one thing you've always wanted to try but haven't? This gives people a way to connect. And it also gives you something fun to talk about as you're starting a meeting. Since we are virtual now, we don't have that little bit of connection, and we need to plan for that connection in both our meetings and our trainings. Also, creating that connection, especially with onboarding or other virtual technology and meeting, as Julie just mentioned, is that video feature. I today put on makeup. I don't always put on makeup when we are having meetings. So giving people a heads up that video is encouraged is really, really important. Putting a note in, the location of the meeting, Zoom, video encouraged, lets people know that they should be camera ready, whatever that means to them. Sometimes that is a hoodie and a messy top bun for me, and sometimes it's makeup. So giving people the opportunity to know that they're going to be on video. Video helps that connection from near and far and helps create it. Also setting an expectation that videos can be turned off at some time. Sitting here and smiling through a 2-hour meeting might not be what is good for learning for everyone. So letting people know that they should feel free to turn off their video when they need to take a break as well. But video is a way to enhance our virtual learning. Just because it's virtual doesn't mean you can ignore all aspects of effective instructional delivery. I think when this pandemic first started, we jumped into virtual learning and said, let's just get on camera, let's try it. Now we've had more time and we're moving past the urgency and moving into what is going to create a great educational environment for all of our staff. So looking at what makes good virtual education is very similar to what makes good in person. Practice, practice, practice. We've practiced this presentation. We've practiced other things. I want you in the chat right now to write what makes virtual education good. Think of some virtual education that you've gone to that you thought, wow, that was really good. Type 1 or 2 things that made it good. On the flip side, if you prefer, type 1 or 2 things that have made a virtual education or virtual meeting really bad. Maybe something that you think, I hope I don't have to go to that education again. Hopefully not this one. Hopefully you aren't writing about this one today. We can start seeing some common themes. But when I talk about adult learning, one of the big keys of adult learning is adults know most of the content that we are going to present. It is our jobs as facilitators to help draw it out of them. I can see in your comments that a lot of you know instinctively what makes good virtual education and what doesn't. And so using adult learners' own knowledge to help through education, even in the virtual field. You can also do this in other techniques. Some techniques are anonymous. For example, polling can be anonymous. Julie talked about polling. Polling can be used to get to a heart of a matter. You can ask a question that is meant to stir discussion and have everybody answer anonymously. For example, a question that we use in one of our race equity trainings is, the people who come to court or show up for their virtual hearing are the ones who care most about their case outcome. Now, in virtual learning, you could have people talk or chat about it, but really to get the heart of a matter, you could put a poll or an annotated line and have everybody check where they are on that continuum. That can lead to a great discussion about why people can or can't get to their hearings. So having a method that involves everyone and also can involve them anonymously is a great method. Make it as interactive as possible. An hour lecture online is death. Now, humor is also good and important in any online learning as well. If I had a feature where I could have you mark yes or no, maybe just in the chat this time, if you are still alive, please check yes. This is a non-anonymous way to create engagement and interaction, but is a really good one to touch base. If you were originally a classroom instructor and you are used to the immediate feedback of nods and smiles and all of the other interaction to gauge the temperature of a room, you can use this feature to gauge the temperature of the room by using the yes or no check mark. Also interaction is the breakouts. And Julie mentioned that this is one of her favorite features. When we used to do small group discussion, we can now use the breakout feature. It is not that difficult to learn how, so if you're fearful, just give it a try. And as I said before, practice using the feature. I used the feature recently in a race equity facilitation. Talking about racial inequities is a hard topic for many to talk about, especially in a large group. And if we were to talk about it in a large group, people may not be willing to raise their hand and say what's truly on their heart. I used a 2-person dyad where folks were broken off in breakout rooms that weren't planned ahead of time. They received questions that were heartfelt and answered them to each other for about 20 minutes. When we returned back from that, the faces were smiles. The body language was relaxed. People had an opportunity to create a true connection that they've been yearning. A day after that, one of the people in the class told me that it was one of the first times she had truly felt a connection with someone outside of her family since then. So this type of education, when done well, can create this community and share our culture not only in the workplace, but can help create that sense of connection that we're yearning for in this time. And that's the ultimate crux of it, that we need to change our paradigm from, we have to do this and we can't do the learning we used to we get to do this. And we can use some great examples to make this even better than some in-person learning and more inclusive and involve everyone in our process in doing virtual learning. Thank you all for being with us today. We will continue to answer any questions in the chat that we didn't get to. And I want to thank Julie and Margaret and NACM and SJI for allowing us the ability to give this presentation.